Imagine this for a second. A massive global crisis hits, war breaks out, and one of the world's most vital trade arteries just slams shut. A huge economy is suddenly teetering on the brink of collapse. Now, this isn't fiction. This was the reality back in early 2026. But right in the middle of all that chaos, one nation decided to forge its own path. And it turned a potential catastrophe into this incredible display of power and diplomacy. Okay, let's get into it.
This quote, it really says it all. As the rest of the world was kind of holding its breath, waiting for this big US-led coalition to maybe possibly get its act together, India just didn't wait. It acted. And that decision, to go it alone, to rely on its own muscle and its own diplomatic smarts, is what makes this whole story so fascinating.
And we're going to start at the end, with the win. India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, he stands up in Parliament and drops the bombshell announcement. He confirms that after some super intense back-channel talks, they had secured an exclusive, safe passage corridor for Indian ships right through the most dangerous waterway in the world. And the place erupted because everyone in that room knew just how close the country had come to a full-blown, catastrophic crisis.
So the big question is, how on earth did India pull this off? Well, to really get the victory, you first have to understand the sheer scale of the crisis they were facing. So let's rewind the clock a bit and take a look at the one choke point at the heart of all this.
And things escalated with terrifying speed. What started as a regional conflict in late February just boiled over. On March 11th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard made a huge announcement. They were blockading the Strait of Hormuz. And just 24 hours later, those weren't just threats anymore. Ships were actually being attacked, and one of the most critical trade routes on the planet was, for all intents and purposes, shut down. Now, what exactly is the Strait of Hormuz? Well, it's this tiny little strip of water between Iran and Oman. At its narrowest point, the shipping lane is only a couple of kilometers wide, but don't let its size fool you. This little waterway is probably the single most critical choke point for the entire world's energy supply. And this number right here, this just says it all. 20%. That's the share of the entire planet's petroleum that flows through that one narrow strait every single day. So you can imagine, when this choke point closes, the global economy doesn't just feel a pinch, it has a heart attack. And for India, this wasn't just some economic headache. It was a straight-up existential threat. A blockade meant an immediate crippling shortage of crude oil and, even more critically, LPG, that's the cooking gas used in millions and millions of Indian homes. We're talking about the real possibility of widespread fuel rationing, restaurants closing down, massive industrial blackouts, and with 60% of its LPG coming through this one route, there were genuine fears of a total collapse of the domestic energy grid. So, with its back against the wall, India had a choice. It could join the US-led military coalition that was being talked about, or it could find another way. It chose another way. New Delhi pulled off this absolutely brilliant independent double play, walking a super dangerous tightrope between these rival powers. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because you can see how India's strategy had two parts working together. On one side, you've got the naval shield. That's pure hard power, right? A show of force. But on the other, you have the diplomatic gambit, a really sophisticated soft power play. So how did they manage to balance these two? Let's break it down. Okay, so the naval shield part wasn't some last-minute scramble. It was the activation of something called Operation Sankalp. The name means commitment in Sanskrit, and it was actually a maritime security mission that India had started way back in 2019. Its whole purpose was to protect Indian vessels on its own terms, without having to join any foreign coalition. And that foresight, it turned out to be absolutely crucial. So, as part of Sankalp, India sent out 3 of its most advanced homegrown warships, these Visakhapatnam-class destroyers. They positioned themselves in the Gulf of Oman, not to pick a fight, but to send a really clear message. Indian ships will be protected. And this is the key part, they did this while explicitly saying no thanks to joining the American coalition, making sure to maintain their own strategic independence. But having warships on patrol was only half the game. While those destroyers were out there making waves, the real magic was happening behind the scenes. Between March 10th and 12th, India's External Affairs Minister was on the phone, making at least 3 urgent, super high-stakes calls to his counterpart in Iran. This was the diplomatic gambit in full swing. And this all led to a diplomatic masterstroke, just a brilliant bit of deal-making that happened in 3 steps. It all started with a different crisis. An Iranian ship was sunk, and 180 of its sailors needed refuge, which they found in an Indian port.
Right there, India saw an opportunity. As a gesture of goodwill, they chartered a special flight to get all 180 of those sailors home safely. And in return for that gesture, Iran gave India what it so desperately needed: exclusive, safe passage for its fuel tankers. It was a life-saving swap. So, did this incredibly audacious plan actually work? Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing. That level of strategic independence, it always comes with a price tag. So let's take a look at the payoff and then the bill that came right along with it. And the payoff was immediate. You could literally see it. The Indian Navy escorted two huge LPG carriers, the Shivalik and the Nanda Devi, right through the strait. Just look at those numbers. We're talking nearly 93,000 metric tons of critical fuel that made it to port. The domestic crisis was averted. The strategy worked. Which brings us to the price. I mean, getting the ships through the strait was one thing, but how do you actually buy and sell with a country that's under maximum U.S. sanctions, especially during a hot war, without bringing the wrath of Washington down on your head? Well, the solution was basically to create a financial workaround. India had to avoid using U.S. dollars for the whole deal, so that meant dusting off and expanding an old trade agreement that let them trade directly with Iran using their own currencies, the rupee and the rial. They may have even bartered goods for oil. Basically, they built their own financial lane to get around the Western system. But wow, what a gamble. It meant risking some seriously punishing penalties from an angry Washington. You know, this whole episode, the naval deployment, the secret phone calls, the financial risk, it wasn't just a one-off response to a crisis. It was pretty much the public cementing of a new, much more assertive Indian foreign policy doctrine. For decades, India was famous for being non-aligned, right? Refusing to pick a side. Well, you can think of this as the 21st century evolution of that idea. People are calling it the Jaishankar Doctrine, and at its heart is this idea of multi-aligned strategic autonomy. Forget picking one side. This doctrine says India will work with everyone, the US, Iran, Russia, you name it, to ruthlessly pursue its own national interest without getting locked into anyone else's camp. And if you want to boil that whole complex idea down to just one sentence, this is it. This is the doctrine in action. It's a purely pragmatic, interest-first approach where keeping India's economy stable and its people supplied trumps everything else. And that, of course, leaves us with the big, unanswered question. India pulled off a stunning victory for its people, for its economy. But to do it, it had to defy its strategic partner in Washington, and it did so during a time of war. So will the U.S. see this as a necessary survival move by a friendly nation, or will it be seen as a betrayal that deserves some kind of economic retaliation? That is the high-stakes tightrope that India now walks on the world stage, and it's all a direct consequence of its Hormuz Gambit.